Hello, friends. This is Darren Hayes of Pigskin.com. Before we take you to your favorite Sports History Network show, just want to tell you a little bit about some merch that you can pick up that represents your favorite SHN podcast. So far, there's t-shirts, coffee mugs, and even books from some of the authors that do podcasts right here on SHN. Who could buy something better than that, than have the history right from the gentleman that you hear talking about it? But we also are adding things each and every day. And where's that store, may you ask? Well, it's at SportsHistoryNetwork.com. Up at the top, there is the SHN merch button. Click on that. It'll take you right to the store, and you can be representing your favorite podcast and show the world that, hey, on the swag that I'm using, it's the headquarters of sports yesteryear, Sports History Network, and my favorite podcaster, the Sports History Network store. Shop there today. Back in the ancient days of history, people that wanted to have answers would go to the mountain and seek out the wise man. Well, we're going to do that today on some Chicago football history as we go to the wise man of Joe Ziemba in his new book, Bears vs. Cardinals. Joe's coming up with some great insights and stories about the Bears and Cardinals coming up in just a moment.
This is the Pigskin Daily History Dispatch, a podcast that covers the anniversaries of American football events throughout history on a day-to-day basis. Your host, Darren Hayes, is podcasting from America's North Shore to bring you the memories of the gridiron, one day at a time. So as we come out of the tunnel of the Sports History Network, let's take the field and go no huddle through the portal of positive gridiron history with PigskinDispatch.com.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at SportsHistoryNetwork.com.
Hello, my football friends. This is Darren Hayes of PigskinDispatch.com. Welcome once again to the Pig Pen, your portal to positive football history. And we have a great interview session tonight. We're going to talk to our friend. It's an author of multiple books on football, and especially Chicago area football. That's Joe Ziemba, and his latest book is out, Bears vs. Cardinals, the NFL's oldest rivalry. Very interesting title, very interesting topic, very interesting author. We'll bring him in right now. Joe Ziemba, welcome back to the Pig Pen.
Oh, Darren, thanks so much for having me back again. It's been a while. I see the Pig Pen has been remodeled. It looks nice and clean, and really and ready and anxious to talk about the Bears and the Cardinals.
Hey, we kept your spot open at the trough here at the Pig Pen, so you're always welcome here. It's been much too long, and that's my fault. I need to have you on more. More Joe is always a good thing.
And we appreciate that. Thanks so much for letting me babble on a few times. So it's all good. It's all about the history of pro football.
Well, it's probably hard to make an appointment with you because I'm seeing all over social media, and I live, 800 miles away from you. And it seems like you're booked on something almost every evening talking about, the Bears and the Cardinals and your wonderful book. You're on quite the tour allura.
People always say they're living the dream. And right now it is great because the book has come out, and a lot of libraries and different organizations have asked me to talk about the book. And I don't really promote the book. Obviously, I'd like to market it, so that's part of it. But it gives me the opportunity to talk about the Bears and Cardinals. You meet so many interesting people. I gave a talk this week at a library, and an 89-year-old young lady came up and said she was a Bears season ticket holder on the 50-yard line, and her cousin knew George Halas, and she knew exactly what I was talking about when we go back to the early 50s in these talks. And even the fact with old photos where the referees were kind of dressed up with a suit and tie and a hat, and she said, I remember those guys. So it's kind of neat. You meet different types of people, and I really enjoy that as much as giving the talks.
Well, you're definitely hitting a great nerve with the public. I'm sure up in Chicago, they're going ecstatic about it. People, the old Cardinals fans are remembering it. Of course, the Bears fans, new and old, are probably enjoying hearing this relishment of history. And you have quite a bit of history that's somewhat forgotten that a lot of people didn't know about. Maybe you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, the history of both teams is quite unusual. Both teams had fires in their storage units, and I'm not sure exactly when, Darren, but I think it was in the 50s. And so a lot of the history was lost, which means that history that may have been written before was taken as being the truth. Now, we do have some documentation, for example, with the Bears. George Hellis wrote his autobiography and came out in the early 70s, I believe, or late 60s. It first came out in the Chicago Tribune as a multi-daily series. But George was writing this stuff many decades after it occurred, and it's not a big deal. It certainly doesn't matter, but there's a few errors in there. And one of the bigger ones that I saw was I'm questioning whether George Hellis and the Decatur Staleys voluntarily left Decatur in 1921. Again, you say, who cares? But as you and I are historians, you kind of enjoy that stuff and that information. And I think it's kind of interesting in the book what we're able to track down as to why I don't think George Hellis left voluntarily. We in Chicago are certainly glad that he did because the Bears are here right now. And there's something similar with the Cardinals. The Cardinals' history just did not make sense when I did my last book a few centuries ago called When Football Was Football, because I was looking up as much as I can, and I really kind of go deep in research as much as possible, and found out that the dates that the Cardinals continue to publicize are inaccurate. And there's nothing wrong with that. Who cares if we're off a little bit 125 years ago or whatever, but it's been fun. In this latest book on the rivalry, I was able to document where the history was stretched a little bit and who did it. And when all that stuff comes together and you've got a pile of information, you want to make sense of it. I hope that readers will now make sense of the history of both teams, that maybe some of that stuff isn't quite accurate that we've been led to believe. And so that includes the date when the Cardinals started, how the team got its name. There's a couple of old stories that certainly weren't true. One, for example, said in 1920 that the owner of the Cardinals challenged the Chicago Tigers for the right to represent Chicago, and whoever lost the game would hand over their franchise to the other team. And we found out there's absolutely no truth to that, but it made for a good story. And again, we try and provide the reasons why that was not accurate and what happened after that. So lots of fun. And as you mentioned, people are getting into it. We have a lot of nice discussion at these meetings. Again, last week, a lady in the audience who, again, had been a season ticket holder came up to me beforehand, and this talks about the rivalry, how tough it was back then. She said, "I hope you're not talking about the Cardinals." I said, "Well, yeah, it's part of the book, so I have to do that." She said, "Well, I'm a Bears fan all the way through." And then we'll have older Cardinals fans who remember and say, "Did Hellis kick them out of Chicago?" And I'll say, "Well, he certainly helped." And part of that reason was George Hellis authorized $500,000 to the Cardinals in 1960 to leave town, even though the real reason was the blackouts and the TV rights, which happens when you have a city with two NFL teams at the same time, the only city that had that. So the Bears did have something to do with the Cardinals leaving the city of Chicago.
You bring up a lot of different topics there that are like, I have interest peaks going all over the place. I'm sure the readers do too. But maybe let's start at the beginning, because though we found out earlier, I don't read the acknowledgments in books very well, but I do like to read the preface of books. And you have a very interesting opening and sort of a personal opening where you talk about a period in your life and a person in your life that sort of helped propel this book.
Exactly, Darren. And it was my dad who played college football. He went to Mount Carmel High School in Chicago and then went to a little place called St. Benedict's in Kansas. And at that time, there was no real divisions. You either had big schools or small schools. St. Benedict's, which is now Benedictine in Atchison, was considered a smaller school, although they played Creighton and New Mexico State and Wichita State. And he was named first team All-American. And after that, he apparently received a lot of letters from places like George Hellis of the Bears, the Detroit Lions. There was a draft in place, and he did get drafted by the Cardinals in the 12th round, I think, of the 1940 draft. But he never talked about his football experience. He was a coach, and he's actually inspired all of three of my books because of his coaching and his experience. But I've always wanted to find out more of what happened. And ultimately, he got injured in training camp I found a magazine where he made the final roster. I think it was 32 players at the time, but it would have been a simple arthroscopic surgery now. But then he figured, why go through the pain? And besides, Darren, he could make more money coaching high school football than he could as a professional football player in the National Football League back in the 40s. So here's my question, Darren. What do you think his contract called for in terms of payment?
Oh, let's see. We're talking, this would be the Cardinals. And in 1940, you said?
Yes.
So pre-World War II. I'm going to say $100 a game.
Ooh, you're right there. The rookie contract called for $110 a game, but they had to provide their own shoulder pads and cleats. So maybe it did come down to 100. And they didn't get paid if they missed a game because of injury. So all the more reason for him to check out of the hospital and go become a high school coach. But yeah, great guess.
Oh, well, the other thing you piqued the interest, you talked about these fires that both the Cardinals and the Bears had. It was two separate fires, right? They didn't keep all their records in the same place and there was a fire.
Yeah, they had different headquarters. And so someday, it's one of those things we always say as researchers, I want to look into that and see if I can define exactly when the dates were for those. But without a lot of the records, then we're going by hearsay or things that have been published through the years that are just taken as truth, and more so for the Cardinal side than the Bears. We found out that a lot of this information started in the 40s or 50s about that game between the Cardinals and the Tigers, for example, and about how the team got its name. One of the things that has always kind of bugged me was it said that Chris O'Brien, the owner of the Cardinals in 1899, when the team started, bought used jerseys from the University of Chicago and Amos Alonzo Stagg. And Stagg did not like the idea of professionalism. He caused a big brouhaha in the early 20s by syndicating a national letter talking about how evil professional football was. But I wanted to see for sure, and I was able to see if the jerseys match. First of all, Chris O'Brien was 17 or 18 years old. He certainly didn't own the team, and Stagg was unlikely to sell jerseys, but I had a chance to go to the University of Chicago, which keeps extensive record of Coach Stagg's, all his financial dealings and his correspondence. I could not find anything, which doesn't mean much, but they did have photos. And I do have a photo of the Cardinals in 1900 when they're known as the Morgan Athletic Club. And the photos don't match, even though they're not in color. So that's the kind of research that has helped me to understand that there might be little errors here and there as we move through history. Again, it doesn't affect the team today, but we're not changing history, but kind of correcting it or adjusting it a little bit.
Yeah, I always thought that story was kind of odd too, because, the Chicago, of course, was the Maroons. So I'm assuming they probably had a maroon colored jersey, and, to come up with a cardinal red out of the maroon. I just don't get that either. That doesn't make much sense either.
No, and that's why when the team started in 1901, it was called the Cardinals Social and Athletic Club, not named after a bird or a uniform. And Chris O'Brien certainly didn't own the team, although he and his brother and one other gentleman started the first version of the Cardinals in 1899. But yeah, Maroons does not match Cardinal red, at least in my opinion, Darren.
All right. Now, George Halas is always an interesting subject. I have sort of I don't know if everybody else does, but sort of a love-hate relationship. I look through him through history. There's some things that he did were just spectacular, both as him as an athlete, and some of the great things that he did is starting the NFL and keeping Decatur and Chicago, those teams going, and what he did for the game. But other things, I sit there and I look at some of these sort of sly little maneuvers he would make to put the Bears in title contention. Back, there's probably at least 3 or 4 stories where the Bears were in second place and he sort of tried to swindle or did swindle another team into playing an extra game to try to gain an advantage for his team, which you can't blame a guy for doing. It just seems a little bit underhanded a little bit by today's standards.
Yeah. And a good example would be Buffalo. I believe that was 1921, where the Bears invited Buffalo to come to Chicago. supposedly for an exhibition game. And somehow the league counted the game, which the Bears won, as a regular season game, even though there's 2 or 3 reasons why it shouldn't have been considered. But back then, there were no playoffs. The league champion was decided by a vote of the owners at the end of the season, in fact, early the next year. And so in the book, what I've tried to do to present all sides is have some of the authors who have written on that, like Jeff Miller has written extensively on Buffalo, and get his opinion. And he was helpful with providing some articles from the Buffalo newspapers. And we see that along the way, even with Red Grange joining the Bears in 1925, the day after he finished his college career. And the rule was that the pros weren't going to touch the college players, and with the assumption that, he could sign them once their class graduated. Of course, Hallis took it as, well, Red Grange finished his college career on Saturday. On Sunday, he was with the Bears. Although Chris Willis, I think you've talked to a few times, who wrote the exceptional biography of Red Grange, tells us that, the maneuvers were going on well before that Saturday after Grange's final game. Then we also tell a story about Joe Savaldi in 1930, a rookie out of Notre Dame who committed a terrible, grievous crime. Can you guess what he did, Darren? You're a Notre Dame fan.
No, but the story sounds familiar, but I can't put my finger on what he did.
Well, what he did was terrible. He got married. And you couldn't get married at Notre Dame and remain in, they got kicked off the football team, but out of school. So Curly Lambeau was searching around for that to bring Joe Savaldi up to Green Bay, and Hallis was there as well. And supposedly there was some backroom talk that both would lay off Joe Savaldi. The same argument. His class didn't graduate. Hallis interpreted that as, well, he played his final game and he can't play anymore anyway, so I'll sign him. And he signed him to a $4,000 contract, second only to Bronco Nagurski's $5,000 a year. And of course, that brought up some hard feelings. The NFL did get involved, and Hallis and Savaldi, I guess, decided he was going to make more money as a professional wrestler. But Hallis, as you mentioned, the questions, there's 2 or 3 examples of where he may have stretched the truth a little bit. But what an amazing man, and what a great coach and player he was too for many years, till he retired in the late 20s, and all he did to keep football going. As he said once, he didn't know if he could take any money out of the team. He and Dutch Sterneman, who was his partner, wanted to give each other $100 a game back in the early 20s, if they had $100 left. Of course, now the Bears are worth $5.2 billion. So Hallis did something right.
Yeah, a good investment on his part. Now that brings up another question, something that I've always had question a little bit. Mr. A.E. Staley was the original sponsor of the team with his starch company, I believe he ran. And Hallis was a player and coach, I believe, in the very first year of the APFA, 1920.
Right.
Am I correct so far?
You are. Yep.
Okay. So when they became, it was the next year or the year after, when Staley sort of washed his hands of the team, he gave the team in $5,000 to Hallis. Is that accurate? Yeah,
that is correct. And that was midway through 1921. Hallis had toyed with playing games in Chicago in 1920, and then in 1921, others were scheduled to draw a bigger crowd. From my recollection, the home games in Decatur, Illinois could only seat about 1,500 people. And so for Staley, this was a great investment if you look at it as a pure marketing endeavor, to where his team was mentioned in newspapers all over the country as the league started to get more publicity. But I think he was drowning and lost in expenses with sponsoring teams. He had a baseball team that traveled all over, and of course football, and the players worked at the Staley company. Hallis worked out a deal with Mr. Staley where the football team could practice a couple hours a day on company time. So it was a great deal for them. But I think in that letter, 1921, way at the bottom of it, it says, and please be understood, as he's saying to Hallis, once you leave Decatur, don't come back, is essentially what Mr. Staley said. So in the book, I've kind of worked on that, found some other quotes, and as you might see as you read through. And I don't think George Halas left Decatur voluntarily. In fact, I'm pretty certain of it, and tried to lay out the reasons and the proof why that might have happened. But yeah, it was a great deal for a while. And then unfortunately, the Staleys dropped in January of 22, I believe, all their sports. And a lot of the townspeople and, of course, some of the employees who were working or playing on those teams were quite upset. And a cartoon appeared, which is in the book as well, that showed the different products produced by the Staley Company. And they were kind of pushed aside because Mother Staley was holding the football, the new baby, and giving it preference over the other children from the company.
Now, why do you think that Mr. Staley gave, given the teams one thing, that's probably a decent expense right there. Maybe it was just get rid of him having to spend money, but why give Halas, the sum of $5,000, which was pretty good money back, in the early, 20th century.
Absolutely. Yeah. 5,000 was a lot of money and got Halas through the season, but I think that was to really encourage Halas to take the team, and they defined it as being advertising money because the team would be known as the Chicago Staleys. Even though they completed the 1921 season in Chicago, they kept the name Staleys. It wasn't until 1922 that the Chicago Bears were incorporated, which was a whole different story, through the fiasco of Halas trying to incorporate the team or even having a franchise in the league, which the NFL finally recognized him for. But yeah, the $5,000, I think, was to really encourage George Halas and the football team to go away and not come back.
Ah, okay. So not only naming rights, but yeah, get out of Dodge, go to Chicago, or go elsewhere anyway. Okay, interesting. Well, let's take a break. I mean, that's some great news. That's some great things in the book. Let's take the opportunity to once again say the name of your book and where folks can get it, Joe.
Yeah, the name of the book is Bears versus Cardinals, the NFL's oldest rivalry. It's from McFarland. You can order directly from the publisher or the usual online sources like Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Target are all carrying the book. So it's pretty easy to get online.
Okay. Now, you have it called Bears versus Cardinals. So obviously they played some games against each other, and there was a rivalry, I'm assuming, when they both played in the same town. Maybe you could hit some of the highlights of some of the big games and rivalry type things that happen between these two franchises.
Yeah, I tried to go back because every time I do research and I'd see a Bears Cardinals game, it still seemed to end up in a fight. Or fight among the stands, in the stands, or fight on the field, or everybody combined and had a good time getting into a fight. So I wanted to find out where the rivalry started. And actually, it centers around Paddy Driscoll, Paddy, who was a halfback out of Northwestern, actually played outfield one season for the Chicago Cubs. And of course, that he was still in college. He lost his college eligibility. And he played in on the Great Lakes Naval Station team that won the 1919 Rose Bowl. And he and George Halas later played for the Hammond Pros in 1919. So the reason I'm telling you this is that Halas and Driscoll had kind of a nice relationship as players. Driscoll functioned as a quarterback, Halas as the end. Halas was the MVP of the 1919 Rose Bowl. Well, when the Pro League started, in 1920, there was great excitement when Halas was recruiting all these players for the Staleys because he signed the legendary Paddy Driscoll. And that was great news, a big name coming to Decatur. And then quietly, about a week later, the newspapers reported Paddy Driscoll signed with the Chicago Cardinals, then known as the Racine Cardinals. So Halas may have been a little upset with the Cardinals, but his pursuit of Driscoll never stopped. In the early part of 1922, we learn, and from paperwork that I found with the state of Illinois, that Halas not only recruited Driscoll to play for him, but made him an owner with Halas and Dutch Sterneman of the newly incorporated Chicago Bears. Of course, Chris O'Brien, who by then was the manager of the Cardinals, went nuts and went to the league because one of the reasons for starting the NFL was to prohibit or eliminate player jumping from team to team. And Halas was given a slap on the wrist and told that, no, you can't touch Patty Driscoll. He's the property of the Cardinals, which he was. And at the time, the highest paid player in the league at $300 a game, when some of the players were still getting $25 or even $10 at the time. So the story didn't end there, because in November, Thanksgiving Day in 1922, I think you and I have talked about this before, Bears and the Cardinals played, and Halas and Joey Sterneman, the brother of Dutch Sterneman, not only tackled Driscoll, but picked him up and head slammed him into the ground. And that led to quite a riot on the field. Fans got involved. The police got involved. The story appeared in the newspapers about George Halas being knocked down and a fan was straddling him with a pistol pushed up against George Halas's head. And so it just seemed like every time the teams played, there'd be some kind of fiasco. In fact, it was rare. And the other thing about the rivalry, and this is, we talked about Chris O'Brien going nuts. I go nuts when I watch television when the Bears and the Packers play. And it said the NFL's oldest rivalry. And that happened again most recently. But it was the Bears and the Cardinals, when the Bears were the Staleys and the Cardinals were still the Racine Cardinals. Played the year before the Packers even entered the league. But that's not the reason I wrote the book. I just found the stories on both sides so fascinating that it went from a competition. It was mostly the players didn't like each other. You could even find Ernie Nevers talking about in 1929 scoring 40 points against the Bears, which is still an NFL record for one game, and why he did it. And you go into the 50s with Ed Sprinkle, the Bears, and Charlie Trippi taking turns knocking each other out on the field. Fans jumping, I think it was 1957 or 58, jumping on the field to join into a fight. And even when the Cardinals at the end there in Chicago, they moved to March of 1960. But at the end of 58, they wanted to play at Dyke Stadium, Northwestern University, and Halas invoked an old agreement that absolutely no one in Chicago had heard of, called the Madison Street Agreement. And that simply stated the Cardinals could not play north of Madison Street, which ran east-west in Chicago, and the Bears could not play south. And with this agreement, Bert Bell, who was the commissioner at the time, he ruled that no, they'd have to support the Bears. The Cardinals could not move to Northwestern. And some great help on that one as well, because Upton Bell, the son of Bert Bell, was just very gracious with his time and gave me some insight. And the Pro Football Hall of Fame had the minutes from the meeting. Just, again, when the rivalry started right then, 1920 or so, and went to when the Cardinals left. So there's plenty of activity sandwiched in between.
That's tremendous. You said the Cardinals left 1959. Is that what you said?
1960, March of 60. Yeah.
1960. Okay. And that was, you said to Halas, I think you just said at the beginning of this conversation that Halas gave money to them to encourage them to leave.
Yes. Yeah, it's been in the newspapers that there are a couple of things they were concerned about. One was that new American Football League getting involved in Chicago or stealing the Cardinals and moving them somewhere, possibly St. Louis. Cardinals were not making money. That's pretty much accepted. And so at least the newspapers at the time said, and more than one resource said, that George Halas gave the Cardinals $500,000 to assist them with moving expenses. And that gave him the rights to all the television showings in Chicago. Games were blacked out if one team was playing at home and the other was away. A goofy rule, but it lasted for years and years. And that was primarily why the Cardinals left town, although the Halas financial incentive certainly helped them.
Yeah, I mean, 1960, $500,000 is a good chunk of change.
Yeah,
that's probably very encouraging for a franchise to move. You know, it's peanuts today. That's probably what they pay the guy that launders the shirts nowadays in the NFL.
Right.
But yeah, very interesting. So, Joe, this is tremendous that you were able to come on here and talk about this. And I'm so glad that you were able to write this book and record this, because your research is impeccable and your storytelling is everybody loves it. Make sure folks listen to Joe's podcast. He's on a couple times a month. You have a podcast?
Yes, right. Yeah.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about your
network?
Yeah, why don't you tell us a little bit about the podcast?
Well, the podcast is called When Football Was Football. And what we talk about is any kind of old football in Chicago. It's the Bears and the Cardinals, but we've talked about a high school a couple of times and maybe a couple of college things. And some of the individuals you may not hear about. We've talked about Shorty Ray a couple of weeks ago, who really revised the way officiating is done in the National Football League. This week's episode talks about Jack Glenn, which is one of the resources I had for this game. He was the 19-year-old general manager of the Cardinals back in 1919. A great story. His family had kept his documents for over 100 years. In fact, his niece, I believe it would be, is a missionary in Bolivia, a nun. And she was the one who uncovered these documents after all these years. And speaking of documents, before we go, Darren, I want to mention my personal thanks to John Kendall and the Pro Football Hall of Fame. A lot of what we talk about is based on the Dutch Sterneman papers. And the Sterneman papers, Sterneman was the partner of George Halas in the 1920s until the early 30s. And the family kept all the financial records of the Bears at that time. That's what Sterneman did. So we know what the salaries were. And I talked earlier about Bronco Nagurski and Joe Savaldi, the contracts for different games, even how much a mechanic in the north side of Chicago who was paid $4 a game and plus a pass to go scout for the Bears back then. And so I was able to use a ton of stuff. Thanks again to John Kendall and the Pro Football Hall of Fame which is probably, in my opinion, the greatest collection they have there is the Sterneman papers.
Wow. Now you get to actually go into the Hall of Fame and use the research facility when you're doing research for your book, correct?
Yes. And Hall of Fame has always been very receptive. I don't know why they let me in, but they do. And when the Sterneman papers came out for a couple of years, they were kind of off base. And the reason why was the Hall of Fame was categorizing everything. And so now they've all been put in boxes. There's a nice index of what is where and made it really easy. And I was able to make copies of the documents that were specific to my research. So John Kendall's been there every step of the way, the archivist at the Hall of Fame, and I just can't thank him enough. And a lot of other people helped as well. Chris Willis from NFL Films. You've always been encouraging. I mentioned Jeff Miller, Upton Bell, John Steffenhagen, who's an expert on the Rochester Jeffersons. A lot of great folks that have been able to help out with this research. So I thank them publicly.
Yeah. Now, I guess maybe you're mentioning all those names. Maybe we should put a little bit of a plug in for the PFRA, the Professional Football Research Association. We are going to be having a meeting in 2023 in Pittsburgh, where pro football started. George Bazika and the gang is organizing this great venture to take that down there. So if you're interested in real professional football history and some great things, we had a big meeting last year in Canton at the Hall of Fame and some places around there, Massillon and the city of Canton. But this Pittsburgh trip seems to be very intriguing as well and very full of football history going back in Latrobe athletic clubs and things like that. So I know they have some great guests lined up and some great events. If you're interested in that, you can contact us here at Pigskin Dispatch, which is pigskinddispatch@gmail.com, or go to the PFRA website. And I believe it's professionalfootballresearchers.org. I think I might have that off, but it's something like that. But we'd like to see you, and you will meet folks. Usually, Joe's there, I'm there. He talked about Jeff Miller, and some possibly Chris Willis might be there. There's a lot of people that usually show up to that are all football historians and experts in the field, and it's just some great camaraderie, and you get to rub elbows with some really knowledgeable people about football.
Yeah, it is a great time. And again, all you got to do is for me, because I can't remember all the letters, is I go PFRA and it usually shows up. And the website is open to non-members as well. So if you want to look around there is a member section that you have to be a member, obviously, to take a look at. But we're expecting a great meeting next year. And George, as you mentioned, Darren, always does a wonderful job in putting it together. And he's also the mastermind behind the book series that the PFRA has been putting out the last few years.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. A lot of great resources. And when it's saying a membership fee, it's very inexpensive. I believe it's like $35-$40 a year. And I think the whole weekend, the 3-day weekend is like $75 if you're a member next summer. So very affordable. Of course, your room and meals are separate. I think they do include 1 or 2 meals in there too.
Yes.
$75, but well worth the money. And especially the history you get to see and experience and learn about is just phenomenal.
Yeah, it's something I've always enjoyed attending, and it's almost like Disneyland for football people who love their history. Every time you turn around and the breaks in the hallway, and being able to talk to folks who just have that passion and that love of pro football history, it's really exceptional.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Joe, really appreciate you coming on here. Why don't we give the folks one more time the name of your book and where they can get it, and if you want to share any social media that you have.
Oh, thanks so much, Darren. Yeah, the book is called Bears versus Cardinals, the NFL's oldest rivalry. Available from McFarland Books or Amazon, probably be the 2 easiest places. Also have a Twitter account, which is called @CardsChicago, and a Facebook account of Chicago Cards. If you want to just look up Chicago Cards, there's over 12,000 people now who follow the Chicago Cardinals Facebook. And we, again, take great pleasure in uncovering those types of stories that you may not see very often. And so we'd invite you to join us and continue our investigation, our history, and our enjoyment of old-time professional football.
Well, Joe Ziemba, historian, podcaster, author, we thank you once again for sharing your great knowledge and your stories and your time with us again tonight.
And thank you so much, Darren, and all you're doing to protect and preserve the history of football. In fact, and your podcasts are amazing. I don't know how you do it, but congratulations. Keep up the good work. And thank you so much for having me here again.
Sure. I think people call it an illness. At least that's what my wife calls it. But thanks, Joe.
Thank you.
We're taking a peek over at the chains and the down marker. It's 4th and long. We're going to have to punt the ball and get on out of here, but we'll have another series tomorrow for your football history headlines, so be sure to tune in. We invite you to check out our website, pigskinddispatch.com, not only to see the daily football history, but to experience positive football with our many articles on the good people of the game, as well as our own football comic strip, Cleat Marks Comics. Pigskinddispatch.com is also on social media outlets, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and don't forget the Pigskin Dispatch YouTube channel to get all of your positive football news and history. Special thanks to the talents of Mike and Jean Monroe, as well as Jason Neff for letting us use their music during our podcast. Pigskinddispatch.com is a proud affiliate of the Sports History Network, the headquarters of sports yesteryear.
Hi, everybody. Dan and Andrew from Hello Old Sports here. We wanted to drop in and let you know about our latest episode.
That's right. We interviewed the co-authors of Phyllis George, Shattering the Ceiling, a biography of groundbreaking broadcaster Phyllis George. And her life is really sort of a journey through 20th century America, from Miss America pageants to the Kentucky State House to the groundbreaking NFL Today show on CBS, even the Kentucky Colonels of the old ABA. We got into all sorts of stories about the Celtics under Red Auerbach, about the interview with Roger Staubach, about really all sorts of things, a fight between Brent Musburger and Jimmy the Greek. We really enjoyed talking with Lenny Shulman and Paul Volpone, who teamed up to write this book.
The book is on sale right now, wherever books are sold. But, within reason. Garage sales, probably not. So go ahead and pick up a copy today. And if you want a chance to win the book, you can go to sportshistorynetwork.com/giveaways and register for a chance to win. Goodbye, old sports.